fantastic, reverential, deathly hush. I'm not sure I will be able to live up to the level of events. It's a great privilege to be able to welcome John Micklethwait, Adrian Wooldridge, back to Policy Exchange. John is, of course, one of our founding trustees, veritable gaulliste du premier jour, as it were, in terms of Policy Exchange. Adrian, very dear friend over many years and inspiration to us all, not a gaulliste du premier jour, but who is willing to come on the platform of a modernizing entity such as this. And we're particularly privileged to do it for the fourth revolution. A particularly suitable title because I'm informed that both Bill Clinton and the Chancellor of the Exchequer have read the first four chapters of this great work and have thoroughly approved of its contents. So, this is the first of the launch events here in London. We're proud to sort of, as it were, inaugurate it, not quite with a clank of a champagne bottle against the side of the hull, but nonetheless in full celebratory mode. So, John, Adrian, welcome here. We look forward to hearing what you have to say and then throw it open to questions. Thank you.
Basically, it's a delight to be back here. It's come a long way, Policy Exchange, since I was stuck in a somewhat smaller office, trying to hold the Dean back.
With a somewhat smaller Dean.
With a somewhat smaller Dean as well. That was rude.
It's the nicest thing you've ever said to me.
Yes, the clue to the book is in the subtitle, The Global Race to Reinvent the State. And a good starting point is when you think about any kind of competition, the worst form of competition to be in, the worst form of contest to be in, is one where you don't know you're in it, where you're Encyclopedia Britannica and you think you're struggling with other forms of reference encyclopedia and you're completely unaware of Wikipedia or the British motorbike industry in the 1970s, and you don't even begin to think what the Japanese are doing. And our worry about the state is something along those lines, because when we look at what happens in both Europe last week, and in America and the midterms coming up, we just come back from going around there, we get the same feeling, which is voters on the whole have a sort of discordant apathy. They are cross and angry, furious. If you look at the membership of the Tory party, it's gone from 3 million down to 128,000 people, enough for any kind of business management to get replaced. You look at any numbers for how low the approval rating of different political organisations are, they're incredibly low. So people are very angry, but we would say they're also incredibly apathetic. They have no expectation at all of change. Look at every poll, they always say, I don't think anything's going to really happen, no matter which way I vote. And so it's cries of frustration and anger at the polls. And we think that basic feeling that politics will never change, that government will never change, even the great emerging leader of the next European Commission, or at least the one backed by Mrs. Merkel, who famously said, we as politicians we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get elected once we've done it. So it's not just the voters, it's the elites as well. Which way is it going to go? Well, our news, the message of this book is that attitude that nothing is going to change is completely wrong. It's completely wrong for a sort of good reason and a bad reason. The good reason is if you look back through history, if you look back through these 4 revolutions we talk about, then actually the evidence is very clear. Government really does change quite quickly. Also, if you think about technology, if you really think the same kind of gales of technology that are swept through the private sector are never going to hit the public sector, well, maybe you're right, but there doesn't seem, from our point of view, much of an expectation that will be that way. The bad reason is that this time the West is in much more of a competition than it thinks it is. There is a kind of model out in Asia, particularly, of a competition. There are other people trying to build a state in a different way, trying to take on the Western model. So that is the starting point, that there is a race, and it does involve more forces, but it does fundamentally involve change. And Adrian's now going to tell you about the 3 revolutions that pushed the West ahead of the rest.
Charles Moore, in today's Daily Telegraph, said he found it difficult to remember what the 4 revolutions were, 4 being an extraordinarily large number for a great conservative intellectual to get his mind around. But I'll try at least to begin to explain what 3 of those revolutions were. The first revolution was really the rise of the nation state in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this was a revolution that basically had as its symbolic head Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan, and had as its central project the provision of public order. If you look at what the world was like in the 16th and 17th century, only a madman would have thought that Europe would become the center of global civilization. There were 3 cities in Europe in 1640 which had populations of more than 300,000 people. That was the population of the heavenly city, of the forbidden city in Beijing alone. And many of those 300,000 people in Beijing were Mandarin civil servants selected from the entire population by a rigorous process of examination. So anybody really would have bet that the future belonged to China or perhaps India or perhaps the Ottoman Empire, but certainly not to the blood-stained backwater that was Europe. Thomas Hobbes himself was born during a thunderstorm because his mother was so terrified that the Spanish Armada was about to land that she gave birth to him prematurely. The British Civil War, the English Civil War, during which Hobbes wrote Leviathan, claimed the lives of a higher proportion of the population than the First World War. This was a very violent and difficult time. And what happens in the next 150 years or so is very remarkable. First of all, European nation-states solve the public order problem in the sense that they get the aristocrats, the landowners, under control. They get them to obey national laws. Secondly, they get the religious question out of politics through cuius regio, ius religio. But secondly, they do all this. They create national public order without sacrificing the virtues of competition. So there's a vigorous competition that continues between the nation-states of Europe, competition for military dominance, competition for trade dominance, and competition for strategic advantage. In China, everybody's looking inwards. There's a sense that this is a perfect empire. It doesn't need to compete with anybody else. There's a sense that they've got everything just right, that they'll be contaminated by the rest of the world. So at one point, the emperor even says to the people who live on the southern coast, which is the most prosperous part of the country, you must move 17 miles inland because you're starting to trade with the rest of the world. This will contaminate you. So they look inwards, ever more inwards. Europe, whilst establishing public order, looks outwards, establishes trading empires, establishes global dominance as a result of that. So this is the beginning of a creative state-making process. The second one of our great revolutions really happens in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is the revolution which is associated with the French Revolution or with the American Revolution, but the one that we're really interested in is what happens in the 19th century in Britain, partly because we're British, so we might as well wave the flag, partly because Britain is the center of a global empire. Britain is the America of its day, and partly because this liberal revolution which takes place really has huge messages for today. This is a revolution which is conducted in the name of accountability, efficiency, and control of the state in the name of individual rights. It's a revolution that's really associated with the utilitarians, with Bentham, with John Stuart Mill. And it's a revolution which leads to an actual reduction in the size of the state. In 1815, the British state is extracting about £80 million worth of taxes from its population to support itself. By 1846, it's extracting 60 million. And during this time, it's providing better public services, it's providing schools, it's providing hospitals, it's providing a sewerage system, it's providing roads, and it's doing that to a population that has increased by 50%. How does it do this? Essentially, it does it by getting rid of a state that's based on patronage, corruption, sinecures, providing work for the idle layabout upper classes. Micklethwait's ancestors, essentially. It gets rid of this world of sinecures and says that if you're going to be in the civil service, you have to get there by open public examination and you have to perform a job. Everything is tied to performance. People who can perform well are promoted. People who don't perform well, who are rent seekers, who are sinecure holders, are kicked out. So that's what happens to the British state. It's a remarkable achievement, and this is done at a time when Britain is also celebrating liberty, when it's allowing people like Marx, it's allowing foreign terrorists, foreign dissidents to come and settle in Britain. Britain becomes the great magnet of that because it says, in the name of freedom, we will not be examining their mail, we will not be interrogating them, we'll let them settle in this country. So it's an extraordinary flourishing of liberal society. Unfortunately, I think, you begin to get a drift as the 19th century wears on towards a bigger state, partly in the name of compassion. You have people like Dickens writing books saying how terrible it is, Gradgrind and the rest of them. You have people like Mill himself saying, well, wait a minute, it's not all that just to have a system of open competition if some people go to Eton and other people don't get any education at all. The state must intervene to provide some basis of equality of opportunity. At the same time, you get the sense of national greatness, a national greatness campaign coming from many, many quarters, basically saying that if you look at our biggest competitor, Germany, they have a big state. They have big tariffs, they have a lot of investment in education, they have a lot of investment in universities, and they are beginning to dominate the new industries of their time, chemicals, engineering, and the rest of it. So we must have a big state in the way that they have a big state. And that leads really to our third revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is the rise of the state, the modern welfare state. And if Hobbes is the great symbol of the first, and if Mill is the great symbol of the second, the great symbol of the third is Sidney and Beatrice Webb. These are people who believe passionately the state is an agent of efficiency, virtue, and planning. They believe absolutely that the state can do things more sensibly than anybody else, and they managed to permeate the entire political system and persuade them that the state is, whatever the question, more state is the answer to that question. So they set up the London School of Economics, they set up the Fabian Society, they set up the New Statesman, all of which are designed to preach this doctrine of statism. And you have, from then on, essentially a bigger and bigger state. You have, in the 1930s, the New Deal in the United States. You have in the 1940s in this country, the New Jerusalem, the idea that the state is not just solving problems, but is actually beginning to build heaven on earth. You have the Great Society in the 1960s in the United States, the idea that the state can actually solve poverty, can solve racism, can solve prejudice. The state is intruding itself into more and more areas of life. And this produces remarkable results for a long period of time. You have sustained rapid growth. You have more and more employment in more and more pleasant places like universities. And you have an expanding public sector that doesn't seem to overburden the economy. But nevertheless, as the 60s turn into the 70s, things begin to go wrong. You have Britain becoming an ungovernable country. You have veto groups, trade unionists stopping the government from making decisions. You have stagflation, meaning that you're not getting any more economic growth. You have a rise of crime. You have a general sense of despondency that the system is not working. And you have more than that, you have a sense of moral decay. And I think the most appalling example of this moral decay happened in the late 1970s with two schoolboys, both of them just having finished school, waiting to go out to Oxford, two elderly men, a sauna in San Francisco. One of those boys is here, and he's going to tell you about what happened to him.
I was traveling around America, and I was on my gap year, as they say, between school and university. And I was traveling with somebody who's a relation of a man called Anthony Fisher, who was an elderly man who had made a fortune out of chickens. Actually, a relation of Rachel Whetstone, who was one of the people we helped set Politics Change up with. And he lived in San Francisco, and I went to go and stay with him, this friend who was a relation of his. And he insisted on going to have a sauna with this man who was his neighbor, not uncoincidentally, called Milton, who lived around the corner. And we went, and we had the sauna, and we sat there, steam rising, and this small figure began to lecture us about, did we know Margaret Thatcher? No, of course we didn't. We were both 18, had no interest in politics whatsoever. Did we know what she was going to do? No, not really, but he began to talk about the fact that they would sell off British Rail, that they would sell off British Leyland, that they would start to do something called monetarism, that they would include school vouchers and all these various things. I just sort of sat there and I thought, this is mad. I've just come from a kind of boarding school in Yorkshire. We used to be taught by candlelight because the miners had turned off the lights. It seemed so utterly incredible as an option to be coming forth. this man, and later in that same trip, I went to go watch the Grateful Dead play, and I remember thinking that whatever hallucinogenic experience that was, it wasn't as weird as this man in the sauna banging on about the world to come. The man was Milton Friedman, and it was Milton Friedman in the sauna. It was me who was wrong, because actually what I was hearing was an early version of Milton Friedman's Road to Ruin speech, where he used to have all these lines about if the federal government was in charge of the Sahara in 5 years' time, there would be a shortage of sand, and all those sort of things. When we were looking for the book, they kept on coming back. What happened was Friedman and Reagan and Thatcher did change things. They amounted in our world to half a revolution. They managed to swing things back against the big state, which the Webbs and other people had created. But it was only a half revolution. They won a lot of things to do with business. They removed the state from business, a lot here through privatization. And again, like all the other revolutions we've talked about, these things came from here and they spread all the way around the world. You look at what happened in Eastern Europe, look at what happened in Latin America. They also won the argument, I think, in a way that it's quite difficult. Even now, Ed Miliband never stands in front of you and says, I believe. I love the idea of him standing up here, but he never stands in front of you and says, I believe in big government. In America, it's impossible for anyone in the Democrat Party to actually say that, because the idea that big government per se is a bad thing is now part of the emotional currency. But against that, if you look at the numbers, not so much changed. Thatcher had 10 tumultuous years. And in that course of that time, she managed, and this is an amazing achievement, to reduce British social spending, British welfare spending, from the huge number of 22.9% of GDP all the way down to 22.2% of GDP. There was virtually no change, and straight after them, stayed down a bit under Blair. It was swept up under Gordon Brown. In America, Clinton actually managed to close down some of the government that Reagan hadn't, but straight away again under George W. Bush, who expanded it more than Lyndon Johnson, straight away under Barack Obama, government has sprawled. In fact, the one big thing which all of us in this room, even the more elderly ones, it's been a basic fact of all our lives for at least the past century, the ever-expanding state. That has been the one constant, and it has not just been to do with the size of the state, it's to do with regulations. Sidney Webb was the son of a hairdresser. Even he would be rather surprised if you go to Florida now. You need 2 years to get a license to be able to cut people's hairs, 2 years to be able to get a license to be an interior designer. Whatever these things involve, whatever Leviathan was about, it was not about trying to prevent the state coming in to prevent you from ending up with clashing colour schemes in your living room. It's not just the rules. You look at the flat where George Orwell wrote 1984, I think there are 36 cameras, security cameras in the streets around that. It's the element of excess, which you saw with Snowden in America, the state getting too big. And whose fault is it? It's well worth running this. It's all our faults in some ways. It's both the left asking for more hospitals, asking for more schools, and the right asking for more prisons. It's both the left asking for some regulations, but also the right as well. If you look at regulation in this country, a hell of a lot of it comes from the Daily Mail, not from the Guardian. It's calling for something to be done about things. And ultimately it's from us, because we have lived in a culture of more. Whatever we have wanted, in the end, the state has given us, and the way people have got ahead in politics is either to hand out more, sometimes it gives people tax cuts, but to keep on giving more and more and more. But, and this is the great sort of saving point of our book, is that we think that will change. That, in a sense, to use the quote from Herb Stein, the famous old economist, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And that, I think, is really the truth about the state. And Adrian's going to quickly explain about that, and then I'm going to come back at the end, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So we do believe that we're on the verge of, indeed, in the early stages of a fourth revolution. Now, people have argued that the state is about to go through a new revolution. Bill Clinton had a whole program about reinventing government, and this has always come to a disappointing end. Why should this time it be any different? I think the first reason is because it must be, because the old way of doing things has reached the end of its road. The Keynesian notion of spending your way out of problems was meant to be a solution to severe problems, to recessions that might lead to depressions, boost the demand when the private sector won't do that. That has become an addiction across the West. It's become something that has become a routine that you do all the time. I think America has balanced its budget 3 times since 1960. The French have done it the same number of times over that period. In other words, people are running deficit financing as a way of life. I don't think that's something that's sustainable in the long run. And if you look at the buildup of debt, it's got higher and higher. Since 2007, according to McKinsey, I think Western countries have borrowed another $16 trillion. So we need to bring that under control, particularly if you look at the demographic profile of the population. The huge baby boom population is about to retire, is beginning to retire. And that's going to mean that we have to have a smaller base of people supporting a larger and larger group of retiring people, which will make that entitlement, overindulgence, very, very difficult. Secondly, I think there are very good reasons to think we can manage the state better than we have, that management is a potential solution to this problem. The state, in many ways, seems to belong to a different era from the private sector, and we can do a great deal simply by bringing the state into the modern era. If you look, some of the state operates as though it's still in the agricultural sector. The whole school calendar, particularly the very long summer holidays, during which, as far as in my experience anyway, the children actually forget everything they learned over the previous year, is because children had to go out and help with the harvest. That's even crazier in the United States, where they get 3 months off in the summer, which is really an extraordinary problem. But if it doesn't belong to the era of agriculture, it certainly belongs to the era of early industrialization, when basically the whole notion was that you have vertical integration. The company does everything. It controls the entire supply chain. Henry Ford once owned the fields on which grazed the sheep, which went into making the seats for his cars. That is very much the public sector mentality. Everything, if it's provided by the public sector, it has to be done by the public sector. It has to be controlled by the public sector. So I think simply by moving management into line with modern management practices in the private sector, you could do a great deal. But there's something much more profound going on than that, and that is the information technology revolution. Essentially, if you look back to the 19th century, you had an industrial revolution which massively improved the productivity of the manufacturing sector and changed the world as a result of that, and massively reduced the number of people who were involved in industrial production. You are getting the same thing in the IT sector. We're at the early stages of this revolution, and the state is essentially intensively an IT sector. It's essentially a service sector and can be transformed by the IT sector. When I was at university many, many years ago, I remember going to some lectures. I didn't do it very much, but I did go to these lectures on medieval history, and this gentleman stood there reading very, very badly from some sheets of yellowing paper, and after every sentence he coughed, and he continued to do this, and after finishing every page, he put the page that he just read behind the end. And so when he finally reached the end, he started again. And so I rapidly learned that you don't go to lectures. But that seems to be a paradigmatic example of where a lot of the public sector is operated, doing things that don't need to be done, because the whole of modern technology, information technology, means that essentially you can broadcast a great deal of this information. A lot of the work of transmitting basic information can be done much more efficiently than it has done before. And I think this is beginning to change and will completely change the public sector. Even things such as fighting wars are being changed by mechanization, by drones, by technology. The police force is becoming dramatically more efficient, simply because we can track crime and allocate resources to dealing with crime very quickly. So I think IT changing things and will change things. We're at the beginning of a sort of industrial revolution. Now, a lot of people say, well, this is airy-fairy talk. You can't possibly do this. The public sector is much too difficult to change. You will not be changing this sector. I think that that's wrong. I remember going to New York in the 1980s and 1990s. This was a very scary place to go. The crime seemed to be out of control. And under Giuliani, because of a combination of better management and later better technology, they basically got the city under control. Crime rates plummeted because of better use of resources and better allocation of manpower and spotting crime rates. I think you can see lots of examples of the public sector beginning to work much dramatically more efficiently than it did in the past. But I just want to talk about an example of a country which, in my opinion, has demonstrated that we do not have to put up with ever bigger and ever more inefficient government, which is Sweden. If you look from 1945 to 1993, Sweden's government got relentlessly bigger. The answer to every question was more government, and the answer to every question about how you fund that increased government is more taxes. So by 1993, 67% of GDP is going to the government. Taxes, in many cases, for the very high earners, are above 100% of GDP, so talent leaves the country in droves. And basically, the country hit the limits of big government. It hit the buffers, and it decided that it needed to change. And what's happened since then is the size of government has fallen dramatically, so it's now 49% of GDP. Top tax rates have fallen by 22 percentage points. Inheritance tax has gone. Corporation tax has been slashed right down. They've balanced their budget in the long term. They've created a system whereby they have to run a surplus every 3 years. Over the 3-year cycle. They've brought their pensions under control. They've raised their retirement age. They've linked their retirement age to the aging of the population. All absolutely sensible reforms, but they've done something more than that. What they have done is said that actually we can apply the spirits of entrepreneurship, the spirits of innovation to the public sector. We can keep the public sector, we can keep schools, hospitals, and the rest of them free at the point of delivery, but we can create a class of welfare entrepreneurs. So they gave all of their pupils effectively school vouchers. Milton Friedman's great idea was actually put into practice in Sweden, not the United States. They've allowed parents, groups of parents to run their schools, or voluntary organizations, but also companies. Companies not only can run schools, they can run chains of schools, so that a lot of the schools are run by private equity companies now, exactly the same for hospitals. And what you're seeing now is an improvement in the productivity of that sector and a sense that you can provide a welfare state, all the benefits of a welfare state, with a smaller, well-balanced government that allows for entrepreneurialism in the private sector, from the private sector in the public sector. So you can come back from big government and change things. So you can change things, you have a new technology which is changing things, you have examples of reform, and you have finally one massively important thing, which is forcing change. And that's something that people don't think about enough, but should do, which is global competition.
We'll finish very quickly by just telling you about that. If you want a symbol of it, you can go to this place with which we start the book, which is on the suburbs of Shanghai, and it's called the China Executive Leadership Academy in Pudong. And you arrive, and it looks very kind of military. There's barbed wire on the outside. There's rather strangely named Future Expectation Street. And you walk up to this building. But once you're inside, it feels a bit more like Harvard, but Harvard as redesigned by Dr. No. It has a huge red desk in the middle, a building about twice the size of this, which is scarlet, and an inkwell beside it the same size. Those are the main buildings. Around it, there's lots of dormitories. And this is where China sends the people who want to be its ambassadors, people who want to run state-owned companies, the people who go to be provincial governors. And they are going there to learn about government. Why? Partly because the Chinese want to get back that title. They think they were the people who were the best at government, and they want to discover it from around the world. Partly also because they think, well, this is what we did about capitalism. This is what we managed to do. We looked and saw which bits we wanted and moved on it. Where do they go? They do come to London sometimes, but they go to Chile to look at pensions. They go to Iceland. They go to Scandinavia a lot. They go to many places around the world, although interestingly, not really Washington. But in the end, the place they go to most, and the place which is the sort of main inspiration for them, is often Singapore. Why Singapore? On the one hand, it's very authoritarian, which needless to say they quite like. But the other bit is it has set up this amazingly small government. Singapore has a government which is roughly half the size of ours, and yet it delivers, by most measures, better schools, hospitals, everything, in short. Now, some of that is undoubtedly, a bit of that is to do with all the Asian values, claptrap they sometimes go on about. Little bit maybe to do with that authoritarian thing, but a lot of what Singapore does are simple, basic things, which all those years ago when we started policy exchange, you might imagine that people here would bother to look at. And they are things like, if you are going to have teachers, why not pay the people who teach well much more? Why not get rid of the ones who aren't any good? Why not at the same time you have civil servants? The most amazing thing about this place, and this I think is a big problem for the right everywhere around the world, is that they want a small government, but just like Gladstone, just like the people back in the 19th century, they are prepared to pay for it. So the people at the top of the Singaporean civil service get paid $2 million a year because they think this is something in the same way as if you ran a business. You would think there's a big thing there. If I want it to be run as efficiently as possible, I will pay people. And again and again and again, they've tried to think through this, and that is what the Chinese are doing. What does that mean? That does not mean that we are saying that there is an immediate sense that China is going to bound past us. The Chinese government, as we detail quite alarming in this book, has all kinds of problems to do with how it measures inequality, to do with corruption, to do with provincial mess. And Singapore is very small, although it's worth reflecting that whenever you think something is very small, Athens was quite small as well when it came to government. But, and this is the crucial point, there is a contest now. We think there is a contest between an authoritarian modernization and democracy. And if you believe in democracy, if you believe in the things that we started here, you desperately want democracy to win, but in order to do that, it has got to get more serious about government, and it's got to work, we think, in terms of making it smaller. Whether that's a way of opening up questions or not, we will stop there, but thank you very much. Sorry, there's a microphone, sorry.
Ian Orr, you're in favour of smaller government. One way in which you can obviously make a government smaller is by reducing what it covers in terms of the area and the number of people. One of the significant things about Singapore is its size, as it is with Sweden. And if they're doing better than the United States, does that mean that in the UK it would be better to have a small Scotland and a small England, Wales, and Northern Ireland? Would they separately do better, do you think, or not?
It's a good question. No one's ever, in all the many, even wandering around American states, has asked us that before. We do think that there are several very obvious things you could do with government. You're right, is the better bits of government in America tend to be at the state level. There are some advantages to proximity, and again, Singapore enjoys those. It's worth noting, though, that technology has made a lot of those things, a lot of distances much, much smaller. In the old days, actually you can see this back in the 19th century, one reason why the original band of liberals were able to rip out government in the same way as I would hope policy exchange would have the same ideal now and make it more efficient. One reason why they were able to do it, because suddenly you had the train, and trains meant you could go and visit a bureaucrat in far-off Liverpool, and or you didn't need to hand it over to some noble to run. You could have somebody who was directly accountable. You could get to go and see that afternoon if you wanted. In the same way now, I think technology is changing things very dramatically. Until very recently, we didn't know how bad our schools were. Now you can go online, you can look at the PISA rankings, see how bad British schools are compared with the Finns or all the Singaporeans, but also now compared with people like the Poles. So the ability to be able to see things, to some extent, I think the limits of movement are there. I think to take our book as a gigantic argument for letting Scotland go free would be a slight stretch, but I'm sure there are some advantages. I think Adrian's going up there to go and beat them up.
This may not be a good thing.
So give your name and organisation. Yes. That's the only house rule, nothing too outrageous.
I'm Josh Swidler from Elliott. What do you consider actually winning? Because if you go to China versus India, India has the democracy or some form of democracy, but certainly per capita GDP is horrible, the roads are atrocious, but China seems to be working. So what is winning?
I think that's, you mean who is winning, or what does winning constitute? What does winning mean? I think that the challenge from China is a really, really serious challenge, and I think that people quite often understate how important that challenge is, not just because of the rate of growth and the sustained rate of growth now over 30 years, but what China has done is to create a model which has many of the virtues of capitalism, many of the virtues of democracy, without what they would consider the vices of it. So what you have is top-down government, autocracy of a sort, but it's autocracy that revolves every 10 years. You know, the people at the top are kicked out every 10 years. We've never seen an example of this in the past, really, I think. Well, never is a big word, but you tend to have autocrats tend to stay on forever and ever and ever, and the system collapses because they get old and mad and self-seeking. This idea that you can change the guard with a limited election is really interesting. Also with state capitalism, they have managed to create something that mimics the virtue of the market in the sense that they have a lot of competition, but keeps some sense of long-term capital investment planning and things like that. So I think this is a serious challenge. And if you look at the relative performance of China and India, that tells you something significant. And if the first thing that Modi did was, when he was elected, was to talk about China, wanting to be as good as China, wanting to be as successful as China. He didn't say, look at America. He didn't talk to Obama. He was obsessed by the Chinese model. So I would say what constitutes winning, nothing, you can never win this sort of race, but I would like to recapture some sort of sense that democracy and freedom, the liberal argument, is not making easy losses, that it's not so overburdened with interest groups and so overburdened with debts that it can't pay, that it's obviously losing a race. I think in the long term, you know, creativity, innovation, all of those things will elude the Chinese, and we have an advantage there. But really, we should be ahead of them in state making. They're making easy gains because of our self-indulgence, I think. Yeah.
Jeremy Thomas, interested spectator, I'm afraid it's my trademark by now. If Western states are to successfully meet and surmount the challenges which you have outlined, how far, while reducing the size of government and increasing its efficiency, might it also be necessary to have a conscious bias towards the analytical skills within the educational system that would enable the rising generations to analyze better to analyze the challenges they face, and thus better to produce logical and relevant solutions to them? I mean, Adrian cited the example of Sweden and the reforms that were successively brought in by Carl Bildt, whose example, I must confess, was impressed on me by my Swedish godmother when I was at a more impressionable age than now, and also Frederick Reinfeldt and Anders Borg. But that is in a system where there is a conscious, and indeed I would go further to say unashamed bias towards science, technology, and rigorous philosophy within the educational system. So how far is the paradox that in order to achieve smaller government, we need a conscious bias towards the skills that would enable us to obtain it?
I think there's a strong element of truth in one bit, and again, it goes back to that problem for the right. I mean, if you look at this, if you think this is the great debate, I mean, you can argue with us, depending on whether they're right or not. But it strikes me that you look at every country at the moment, the question of what the hell you do with the state is moving to the front, and it could be that we have lots of reasons why the Chinese model could fall apart. But even within the West, the countries that answer this question best are likely to provide a better life for their people, and they're likely to get more people to come and found businesses, etc., etc., etc. Now, it strikes me that on the left, you have a very straightforward and actually possibly much more difficult problem than the right. The left's problem is that they have immediate choice between, do you try and look after the poor, or do you try and look after the public sector unions? And that really is an extremely difficult one to get around, because virtually everything you do to do with state reform pushes you into that problem. You can see Ed Miliband wrestling with it, you can see Hillary wrestling with it, a whole variety of different people. On the right, though, you face what you're describing, which is you've got to take the state seriously to start thinking about what it does. But I do think a lot is to do with information. Is that if you start looking around the world, I think it's interesting that the Tories here have actually drawn, to some extent, more on Sweden than certainly, say, the American Republicans are. It's interesting that people here are prepared to sort of think about where different bits might be working where and where we can pull things. I think on the exact question about whether, the precise educational goals, there are definitely, some bits of education may help you do this better than others, and you're possibly right that, say, Singapore and Sweden have slightly greater technical analysis of things like engineering, but I wouldn't, it's more to do with the information. And it's not just, I keep going back to this, it's not just to do with what we say, it's the fact that it's now things are available in a way they weren't before. You can now, you know, in Sweden, the something the Swedes do is they put, it's not just schools, they put the health of their hospitals on, you know, and the amazing thing about this, which is back to Adrian's point about the efficiency of the public sector, is that the gaps are jaw-breaking. You know, even within Britain, you can look at the research for the NHS, you can have two bits which have identical demographics, identical amounts of money, but one bit will be 30% more efficient than the other. That just does not happen in cars, doesn't happen in any of the bits where there is competition. But as stuff gets out there and people can see that their hospital is that much worse, then it begins to change. So it's a very long-winded answer.
Hello, good evening, James Bradley. In the context of saying that a smaller state potentially is successful for the future, more efficient, I just have a slightly pessimistic thought in the context of, you mentioned that technology may be actually perhaps the thing to unlock the capability of having a smaller state. And I just wonder whether actually that might be the reverse, because two examples really. One is thinking of here in the UK that you know, quite often one hears that in industries that were once privatised, we find now that are actually being run by private arms of foreign state companies. You know, the railways, energy, for example, that the private sector British equivalents just don't have the capability to provide that service, that actually, even if one tries to get a smaller state, is difficult. And then the other side of it is also in terms of technology as well, that quite often that technology may be potentially controlled by the state as well, in a certain sense, that it provides a difficulty for new entrants to come in and reinforces the role of the state. So I just wonder whether actually in the future that technology, on the one hand, may be a way to unlock the control of a large state, but on the other sense, there could be an argument to say it may actually be there to help reinforce it, particularly in a country that's smaller, perhaps.
I think there's truth in that. I mean, I think that's, I find the idea of foreign companies running bits of the state very exciting. It's a great idea. I'd like them to do that. Not foreign states running bits of our state, but foreign companies being allowed to do that, because I think it's, I think that that's an engine of competition, an engine of efficiency, and an engine of the spread of best practices. I don't want to go on too much about Sweden, but I went to a hospital in Sweden, in Stockholm, and what they had done is basically reorganize their hospital procedures on the basis of Toyota just-in-time management, which involved doctors and nurses working much more as teams. It involved taking a holistic view of the delivery of healthcare rather than allowing it to be fiefs of doctors, basically a sort of feudal guild system which doctors had. And because this was a hospital, essentially, it was part of the National Health Service there, but it was run by a private equity company. This company had spread its ideas, its way of doing things. They use them. They have hospitals in France. They have hospitals in Germany. And I don't think they have it in England, but they're using those ideas. They're using these models of best practices to spread right across the continent. I think that's a very good and exciting idea, because these variances in performance that you have in the public sector are odd. You know, you don't have them in the private sector, and competition and globalization should be getting rid of them. I think the idea of foreign governments controlling the machinery that we use, I'm not sure about that. Mostly, you know, I tend to find, and I know at work, that I tend to find that I have better computers at home than the ones provided by the company. That's, in fact, you know, a lot of these computers tend to be sort of empowering individuals rather than big organizations. Sorry about that.
Did you, Anne, and then?
So, Anne Micklethwait. Even if voters don't see the picture as clearly as you do, they're probably aware that to a certain extent the game is up, or that there is a big argument. But I think the thing that the state is providing, that I haven't really heard an answer to how we get around this problem, is the state provides reassurance. And reassurance is an important thing. Huh? I mean, we all like to feel that there's a reassurance that we have a healthcare system that can sort of pick us up if we fall through the cracks. It often fails, but yet the state seems to be better at putting that across. I think that also probably goes for state education, and it's why a lot of the whizzy solutions that certainly I and others here propose quite regularly in The Economist maybe don't get the political traction that they could. My other one is just a bit of a sort of question that only occurred to me sort of listening to you now, but when we talk about the small state in this context, do we just mean public services? And where do you stand on the small state and defence? Because it seems in a way that you're arguing for small state, but then the general sort of mood, or at least of the last few years, has been a fairly sort of big state of Britain in the world and Britain and defence. And where do you both come out on that?
I think first on the question of the reassuring state of people needing it, I think we generally, in this book, we make the case for things like schools and hospitals, being public services that come free. The question we keep on saying is who provide. You really, if you're on the left, you really should not care as much as you do about who provides it. It should just be, nobody in Sweden thinks it's terrible that they're getting things. Nobody in France thinks it's terrible they're getting things through private companies. I think in terms of the reassurance, you're right. There's always been an element, you could see this in all the literature, of people, again, quite often on the right as well as the left, repeatedly going back to the state. In any kind of moment of crisis, they kind of are rushing back and think the state will protect them. And so that sort of element, and if there's a point to this book, or there are many points, one of them is to get people to start to think about doctrines of liberty. If you take the debate about privacy, for instance, what you look at what John Stuart Mill and people like that wrote about liberty, is to what extent they thought these were such important principles that they were prepared to get rid of quite a lot of utilitarian reasons, quite a lot, the fact that most people wanted ever more computers on the thing that they would have actually objected to. I think on the final question, which I've now forgotten, but I had a brilliant answer to, which was defence. Yes, sorry, defence. On defence, very quickly. On defence, yes, I think particularly, and a couple of people have pointed, I think Daniel Johnson pointed this out, it's certainly true in Europe that you would expect people to spend more on defence. But in America, you could certainly clean out a lot of the defence budget. There are two things about defence. One is that there is a huge amount of waste in defence, as if you talk to anybody in virtually any armed force will tell you almost immediately. But secondly, there's a question of where it fits in the overall budget. And so much of government accounting is such a mess. I mean, one of the most amazing things about people like Gladstone and things is when they arrived, they got rid, as far as they possibly could, of every single stupid, dodgy statistic. And there's a huge amount of things, like if you give a tax break to an industry, that often is a form of, that's no different to giving them money. It's exactly the same as giving a subsidy. You can see in America, again, I'll use the numbers from there, $1.6 trillion of tax exemptions, nearly all of them going to the rich or to certain companies. That is the right's dirty secret in America. You could argue some of the things to do with taxation are the right's dirty secret here. So it depends how you measure it. But the common thing is unless you start tackling these long-time things like entitlements, welfare spending, then you don't have as much money left for defence. But defence is, as Adrian said at the beginning, that was the original thing about Hobbes. That was the security state.
James Q. Wilson, the great American political scientist, once said the whole point of government is to be inefficient. And that's what you want it to be, because otherwise it will completely dictate your lives. You have to create lots of circuit breakers to stop it from controlling it. And there's a certain amount of truth in that there are certain things you actually want government to be quite deliberative and slow in some of its decision making. You don't want government to be as innovative as the private sector. When you drive down your road, you don't want constantly new innovative traffic light systems. You want some sense of predictability about government. There are things that government is different and has to do, and providing that sort of reassurance. On defence, personally, John doesn't agree with me about this, but I think some of the core functions of the state, such as crime fighting and defence, are in the front line of revolution. They're going to be dramatically changed. The most labour-intensive function of the state throughout its history has been fighting wars, killing people. These have been huge masses of people used. Now, that'll be able to be done by drones and robots. The American Armed Services now employ, I think, 12,000 robots, from great big, huge things to tiny little buzzing things that watch and inspect what people are doing. So I think
they're all controlled by Dean.
They're all controlled by Dean. So I think that the warfare is going to become a people-light information and machine-intensive process. That's going to be one of the great changes in human history in terms of what the state is all about, actually, in terms of the human context of the state.
5 more minutes.
So should we take like 2 or 3 very quickly?
Martin Lewis.
Martin Lewis, could I just ask you what are the key drivers that are going to affect the kind of change that you are talking about in this country, given the real problems that are out there? You know, the problems that give us 650 odd MPs when we should have 450, you know, the tendency of the civil service to operate in silos. We had a permanent secretary at one point who was designed to improve communication between the government departments. That hasn't worked. Everyone defends their territory, and there have been changes with, you know, Prime Minister after Prime Minister promising to cut red tape, achieving that a little, but then once you've cut off the tentacle of the octopus, it disappears into a cave for 6 months and comes out again with the tentacle grown again. What is it about this country, particularly the resistance to change, that whenever anyone proposes anything radical, such as you are suggesting, there's a huge outcry from the media, which may be shaping public opinion to resist change, or may be reflecting a desire amongst the population not to have any change, or to have it in tiny increments? What is it that it would take to actually get the kind of change and get the smaller, more efficient kind of government and the faster, quicker innovations happening in our society, such as the pensions reform that George Osborne introduced? Shocked everybody. Brand new, radical. You know, why can't we get more of that kind of thing right across all sectors of society? Is it because politicians are intrinsically afraid that they're coming up for re-election? And politicians never seem to do, in the first year in which they are elected, the radical things that people might just have forgotten about or got used to by the time the election comes around 5 years later. What is it? What are the drivers we need?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you on the end, but I think there's the simple answer is 1, a crisis. Sweden's a good example. 2, a leader. You've got Thatcher and me back in that sauna all those years ago. You can get people who change. The other, I generally think, is this, and you can look around the world, it's beginning to have this hubbub from below, mayors trying things, people beginning to look at things that work. You know, that it's people, one of the interesting things about the response to this book is, on the one hand, people are suddenly interested in sort of big ideas about what the, you know, in the end, what we're saying is the big idea of, you know, what is the state for? That's something that people need to start asking themselves and thinking about. That's part of it. But a lot of it's just micro things, like people think, why is my school so much worse than that? So those are the background things. In terms of radicalism, I think you could make an argument. You know, the first year of the Cameron coalition government was pretty radical. And actually the lesson, if you were Cameron, would be, if you imagine you were in a circumstance of winning a second term, that, you know, the things that you got on with a clear plan at the beginning, like schools with the opposite obvious example, less clear plan in healthcare, maybe a little bit on welfare, those paid off. You have 4 or 5 years to make it work. So I don't necessarily think it's quite as empty as you think. I think when we look back at the Cameron government, you will think actually they did change quite a lot in some ways, more than perhaps they're given credit for. But in general terms, a mixture between those 3 things.
The 650 MPs is just
they're ludicrous.
Ludicrous.
I think I have an answer to Martin's question. Stephen Cohen, which is that if debt to GDP marches on to 100% of GDP, then governments will be so busy paying back the debt they won't have the money to spend on anything else. A couple of other factoids for you. First of all, Japan, 1947 to 1990, was just like China, a quasi-democracy where everything was run by the mandarins. And there was rotation after 10 years. So we have had that example before. Secondly, why everybody's mentioning Sweden, I don't know. They should look at Estonia, which is far better model of transparency and openness and minimal government. And that created in a relatively short space of time. My question, however, is where exactly is this hubbub coming from? I don't see it, I don't read it. I mean, I understand it, I sympathize with it, I agree with what you said, but I don't see anything coming.
Your job is to go and buy this book and spread it, thereby pushing it forward. So actually, I'll quickly go on. Japan, I think you interpret Japan wrong. What was interesting about Japan was everyone said, oh, look at this amazing business machine. What Japan actually is, I think, a very powerful example of how things can change is the West. Nobody really hyped the Japanese government. There was a bit about Japan, but nobody saw it as an alternative method. What happened was that Japanese business was an alternative method. Western business looked, learnt, and fought back. What's happening now is you have various bits of government, which we're saying for the first time for 500 odd years, are being done better elsewhere. If our governments look, imitate, borrow some things. No, it's much more democratic. I mean, the LDP was a single party state, 47 to 90. So I think without, yes, there weren't many Tiananmens in the sense of how they restricted it. In terms of hubbub, I think there is a genuine, I mean, Adrian, come in, but I think there is a genuine interest. People, this idea that something cannot go on forever, and as you pointed out, people are eventually running into debt. It's partly just the sheer numbers. I mean, $16 trillion is a lot of money to borrow, and that's before you start bringing in things which, again, Britain is not that bad on, which are things like pensions obligations and all those sort of things. You look at what's happening in France, and you imagine, is that going to just stay the same, or is something in the end going to change fairly dramatically? I would go for the second. Do you want to, sorry, should we answer two questions very quickly?
Yeah, two last questions. I think that we can take them as a pair of questions.
I was interested that you focused so much on education. Oh, sorry. Name's Robert Peel, Education Research Fellow at Civitas. Interested that you talk so much about education, and in particular mentioned vouchers. And I think in the English case, it's worth remembering that Keith Joseph was Education Secretary for a disastrous 5 years in the 80s, and for 2 years desperately tried to implement vouchers and concluded that it was absolutely impossible. And even before the Forrester Act in 1870, education was very rarely provided by private companies. It was far more often faith groups and charities and the like. And I'm always quite wary when I hear people talk about private involvement in education, because whilst it may improve efficiency, I'm not convinced it would improve quality and standard. What would you think to that?
And one last question there.
Mike Hobday from Macmillan Cancer Support. I wonder whether you see the fourth revolution as being about a drive for technical managerial efficiency, in which case you could imagine the political parties having a very boring competition to see who's best at it, or whether it's a new vision for us all, in which case you lay open the risk of 5 years on and 5 years off.
On the point of the education, our argument is not essentially that you have to have private companies running all schools or every education system in the world using vouchers. Our argument basically is that you need more experimentation and innovation within the system, particularly more independence for schools to experiment with different ways of providing solutions. So to move away from a state that dictates everything that's done within it to one in which there is more room for maneuver. On the idea of a managerial revolution, I mean, I think we see a lot of these ideas coming from the bottom up, because I think basically the impact of information technology, particularly on the education sector, but also on the policing sector, will be to empower individuals to make choices and to make decisions. It's an empowering thing, and also to improve the delivery of services. But more important in that, I think I wouldn't want to get stuck too much in a managerial sort of thing, because I think the big essence, the big argument of this book is that there is a great competition going on, and that is a competition between various visions of the state. One is the idea that we should have a liberal state with limited government, with entrenched individual rights, on the one hand, the Western ideal essentially, and the second is the idea of a big expansive state with top-down control, authority, basically the Mandarin model that we're seeing perfected in China at the moment. We're seeing a global competition between these two, and we very much hope that the liberal model wins, and in order to win, the liberal model needs to cut back a bit on some of the promises it's made, cut back a bit on some of the entanglements that it's got itself involved in, ask seriously what is the state for? Is the state supposed to be doing many of the things it's not, because I think that the democracy has become weak, flabby, self-indulgence, and has eroded some of its greatest virtues, which are to do with individual freedom. So this is really not a technocratic book. It's a plea for a return to a liberal notion of what the state should be doing.
And one very last thing, that technocrat sounds very, even technocratic stuff can be very, very radical, because you use the label. If you just look at the board of Policy Exchange up there, all the various ideas, some of them sound incredibly micro and tedious, but if they all sound wonderful in many ways, but if you put those things, particularly to a left or centre party, they are very, very difficult. You know, the basic thing of if you run things better, it causes real trouble. If you applied, just get rid of all the Asian stuff, applied some of the Singapore stuff to London, that would still be unbelievably difficult for Ed Miliband, and possibly quite difficult for David Cameron too. So it's not, technocracy isn't, you know, it carries with it its own threat. But Adrian's right, the main big thrust of this is this to drive people back to the big issues about what is the state for.
Thank you. Copies of this wonderful book are available at the back. I'm never allowed to say on sale because it's violation of some sort of rule or another. But I once offered to give them away and I was accused of potential bribery. So anyhow, copies of the books are back, and it's wonderful work. I urge you all to read it, and thank you, John and Adrian. I'm sure we'll sign copies.